He always tried to please everyone, until he discovered the cost of abandoning himself. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginnings. A childhood built on approval. He was the kind of child every adult wished for: polite, quiet, obedient. The kind who cleaned up his toys without being asked, who smiled even when he was tired, who said yes when every part of him wanted to say no. He didn't know exactly when it started, but early on, he had learned that love had a condition. That if he was good, if he behaved, if he didn't upset anyone, the world around him stayed calm. And for a child, that felt like safety. At home, emotions were like weather, unpredictable, sometimes warm, often cold, and occasionally stormy. So he adapted. He became a little weatherman, constantly scanning the atmosphere, measuring people's moods, preparing himself to become whatever version of himself would maintain harmony. When his parents fought, he stayed quiet. When a teacher was stern, he overachieved. When friends got upset, he apologized first, whether or not it was his fault. This pattern of seeking approval was never taught in words. It was absorbed through tone, through body language, through the subtle reward of a smile when he complied, and the tension in the room when he didn't. He began to notice that being agreeable was easier than asking for what he needed. That praise felt better than rejection. That playing small was safer than taking up space. But beneath that polished exterior, something else was growing, something he didn't yet have words for. A kind of quiet erosion. Every time he swallowed his needs, dimmed his voice, or smiled to avoid conflict, a small part of himself dissolved. His desires became blurry, his opinions muted. He couldn't tell if he truly liked something or if he was just mirroring someone else's expectations. He wasn't unhappy exactly, but he wasn't fully present either. It was like he was performing a version of himself that everyone loved, but no one really knew. Not even him. This was the beginning of a life built on approval. And like all foundations that are unstable, eventually it would crack. Chapter 2. Becoming the nice guy. The mask of constant agreeableness. As he got older, the praise for being such a good guy only intensified. Teachers adored him. Co-workers trusted him. Friends leaned on him. He was always available, always smiling, always saying the right thing. He became the go-to person for support, for favors, for smoothing things over. And while everyone around him celebrated his kindness, no one noticed the cost. He had mastered the art of being likable. He knew how to anticipate what others wanted from him and offer it before they even had to ask. He said yes to helping a colleague move on a weekend he had desperately needed rest. He stayed in conversations that bored or drained him just to avoid appearing rude. He dated people he didn't truly connect with, simply because rejecting someone felt cruel. His greatest fear wasn't being disliked. It was being seen as difficult, selfish, or disappointing. But the truth was, he wasn't being kind. He was being compliant. He wasn't acting out of love. He was acting out of fear. The fear of conflict. The fear of disapproval. The fear that if he stopped performing, if he dared to prioritize his own truth, he would lose connection entirely. To him, pleasing others had become a form of survival. And the more he leaned into this identity, the more he disappeared behind it. At first, it seemed to work. People liked him. But he started to notice something strange. They didn't really see him. They saw the version of him he had carefully curated, the agreeable one, the helper, the fixer. When he was hurting, few people noticed. When he needed support, no one reached out. He realized that being everything to everyone had made him invisible to himself. He began to resent it. Not others, but himself. For always folding. For being afraid of his own boundaries. For allowing 1,000 tiny moments of self-abandonment to shape who he had become. The mask of the nice guy was no longer a badge of honor. It was a prison. And while it had protected him for years, it was slowly suffocating him. What he didn't know yet was that letting go of this mask would be painful, but it would also be the beginning of his liberation. Chapter 3. The cracks appear: burnout, loneliness, and the cost of self-abandonment. At first, the symptoms were subtle. Missed calls he didn't return, social gatherings he began to avoid, mornings where getting out of bed felt heavy for no clear reason. But slowly, The fatigue began to stretch beyond physical tiredness. It became emotional, spiritual, a kind of quiet burnout that came not from doing too much, but from giving too much of himself away. He had become everyone's solution, but no one was his. People came to him with their burdens, their needs, their chaos, and he, always the dependable one, absorbed it all, without complaint, without resistance, until one day he realized something frightening. No one really asked how he was doing. And worse, if they did, he wouldn't even know how to answer. There's a unique kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love a version of you that isn't real. He felt it in the quiet moments, after a long call where he had played the supportive friend, or after a workday filled with doing what others expected rather than what fulfilled him. He would sit alone, phone quiet, heart restless, and wonder why he felt so empty. He couldn't pinpoint when the disconnection began, but now it was undeniable. He wasn't living his life. He was managing it, curating it, editing it down to the safest, most acceptable version of himself. The real him, the one with sharp opinions, complex emotions, inconvenient needs, was locked behind a door he hadn't opened in years. That door had been shut so tightly for so long that even he had forgotten what it was like to step through it. But the cost was mounting. His mental clarity was fading. His sense of direction was blurring. And the resentment, once a whisper, was becoming louder by the day. He found himself snapping at small things, withdrawing from close relationships, fantasizing about disappearing or starting over. He didn't want to be this version of himself anymore. But he was terrified of what would happen if he stopped being agreeable, if he started honoring his truth, saying no, taking up space. What he didn't know yet was that the unraveling he feared was actually the beginning of coming home. Chapter 4. A Moment of Truth. The day he said no, and everything changed. It was a small moment, so ordinary it could have gone unnoticed. But for him, it felt like an earthquake. A friend had asked him, once again, for a favor. It was a weekday evening, and he was exhausted. He had planned to rest, maybe read, just have some time for himself. But the request came, coated in guilt and framed as urgent. In the past, he would have said yes automatically. He always did, but something inside him paused this time. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. And then, without over-explaining or apologizing, he said the word that had felt forbidden for years. No. The silence that followed was thick. The friend hesitated, confused, surprised. And in that pause, he felt it. An old reflex tugging at him to take it back, to soften the blow, to say, well, maybe if you really need, but he didn't. He stood by his no. That night, something cracked open inside him. It wasn't just about the favor. It was what the no represented. For the first time in years, he had chosen himself. Not because he wanted to punish someone or assert control, but because he finally recognized that his needs were valid too. He expected fallout, disappointment, maybe even rejection. But it didn't come. The world didn't end. The friendship didn't crumble. And most importantly, he didn't crumble. That moment revealed a truth he had never fully understood. People who truly care for you don't need you to abandon yourself for them. And those who do may never have loved the real you in the first place. After that night, he began to notice how many times a day he would default to self-erasure. How quickly he offered time he didn't have, agreed to things he didn't believe in, or smiled when he wanted to scream. And with each new no, each boundary drawn, each moment of silence he chose over people-pleasing chatter, he felt something return. Not confidence, not yet, but presence, integrity, a sense of wholeness he hadn't felt in years. And from that one no, 1,000 quiet revolutions began. Chapter 5. The Awakening. Learning the language of his own needs. In the quiet that followed his first true boundary, something unexpected emerged. Not relief, not guilt, but confusion. He realized, with a strange mix of fear and wonder, that he didn't actually know what he needed. For years, his life had revolved around others, their expectations, their feelings, their approval. His inner compass had grown rusty from disuse. Now that he had started saying no to what wasn't aligned, he He was faced with a more terrifying question. What do I say yes to? At first, it felt like trying to listen to a voice underwater, muffled, distant, hard to trust. He'd ask himself, what do I want to eat? And freeze. What do I feel right now? And draw a blank. The simplest questions revealed the depth of the disconnect. He wasn't avoiding his needs. He had forgotten how to recognize them. So he began slowly, gently, without pressure. He started journaling, not to perform for anyone, but to observe himself. Some days, he wrote pages of scattered thoughts. Other days, just a single sentence. I feel tired. I don't want to go. That hurt. They were simple truths, but each one was a small revolution. Each one reclaimed a piece of the self he had abandoned. He started paying attention to his body, how it tensed up in certain conversations, how it relaxed when he was alone, how it resisted commitments that drained him. He began to trust these signals. They were data points, clues. For the first time, he was learning to live from the inside out, not the outside in. There were relapses, of course, moments where he slipped back into old patterns, overcommitting, shrinking, people-pleasing without even realizing it. But now, there was a new awareness. A part of him would catch it in real time and whisper, "This doesn't feel like you." And that whisper became his compass. Over time, he discovered that his needs weren't selfish, they were sacred. They were the map to his truth. And by honoring them, he wasn't pushing people away. He was finally showing up honestly, which meant that the relationships that stayed could actually see him. This awakening wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, a series of ordinary moments where he made a different choice, where he paused before answering, where he left a message on read because he needed time, where he cried for no reason and didn't shame himself for it. He wasn't becoming someone new. He was returning to someone ancient, his real self, the one who had been waiting all along beneath the noise. Chapter 6. Rebuilding Relationships Through Authenticity. As he grew more attuned to his needs and stopped abandoning himself for approval, something fascinating began to unfold. His relationships shifted. Some grew quieter, some became strained, and some deepened in a way he never thought possible. For years, his presence in relationships had been defined by one rule: don't rock the boat. That meant being agreeable even when he disagreed, smiling when he felt unseen, showing up when he had nothing left to give. But now, he was experimenting with a new rule: show up as yourself, no masks, no edits. At first, it was awkward. People who were used to the old version of him, constantly available, endlessly accommodating, were confused by this change. Friends would say, "You've changed," and it wasn't always a compliment. Family members would take his boundaries as rejection. Some relationships, built entirely on his self-erasure, began to crumble. He had to grieve those quietly, recognizing that not everyone would walk with him into this next chapter. But for every loss, something stronger took its place. He began to speak with more honesty. Not harshness, just truth. He'd say, "I'm not up for that today," without over-explaining. He'd admit when something bothered him instead of bottling it up. He stopped apologizing for existing. And the people who really cared leaned in. They started meeting him at the same depth he was willing to meet himself. Conversations became more meaningful. Instead of transactional politeness, there was presence. Instead of hiding behind what was easy, there was a shared commitment to truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He noticed that the more he honored his own boundaries, the more he could respect others. His empathy didn't shrink, it matured. It was no longer the kind of empathy that cost him himself. It became a balanced empathy, one rooted in mutual respect, not martyrdom. Over time, his inner circle grew smaller, but more solid. The people who stayed weren't there because he performed for them. They were there because he showed them his real self, flawed, honest, evolving. And in turn, they showed him theirs. That's when he realized authenticity isn't just about being true to yourself. It's about giving others permission to be true with you. Real connection doesn't come from pleasing everyone. It comes from being real and letting the chips fall where they may. This was the foundation of a new kind of relationship, not based on approval, but alignment. Chapter 7. the power of saying no and the freedom it brought. It started as a whisper, an unfamiliar tension in his chest every time he said yes when he wanted to say no. That whisper eventually became a roar, echoing in his mind each time he betrayed himself to maintain peace. For most of his life, no had felt dangerous. It was a door that led to disappointment, disapproval, even abandonment. So he avoided it, convinced that his safety and his worth depended on staying agreeable. But now something had shifted. He had started to realize that every yes spoken out of guilt was a quiet betrayal of his own boundaries. Every time he said yes to please others, he was saying no to himself. So he began small. He declined a weekend gathering that felt more like an obligation than joy. He turned down an extra project at work that would have drained his energy. He even said no to answering a late-night message when he needed rest. Simple moments, but monumental for someone who had once built his identity around being the one who never said no. At first, it felt wrong. He worried that people would get upset, that they would see him as selfish, lazy, unreliable. But the storm he feared never came. In fact, something unexpected happened. He felt relief. A new kind of lightness filled the space where resentment used to live. He wasn't shrinking his truth anymore. He was standing in it. Saying no didn't close him off, it opened him up. It created room for what really mattered. It gave him time to reconnect with himself, to pursue what nourished him, to rest without guilt. It taught him that boundaries weren't walls. They were bridges to a more honest life. Not everyone understood. Some pulled away. Others tried to guilt him back into old patterns. But the more he practiced saying no, the more he realized those who respect your no are the ones truly worthy of your yes. Eventually, no became more than a word. It became an act of self-respect. A quiet, powerful declaration that he was no longer willing to abandon himself for acceptance. And in that space of reclaimed time, energy, and identity, he found something he hadn't known he was missing: freedom. Chapter 8: Rebuilding Identity, Quiet Habits, and Daily Choices. Rebuilding yourself doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in the quiet, in the invisible moments that no one sees. We finally stopped saying yes to everyone. He didn't feel free at first. He felt lost. For years, his identity had been shaped by what others wanted from him. And now, with their approval gone, he was left staring at the mirror, asking a question he had long avoided. If I'm not who they want me to be, then who am I? That question didn't get answered in a single moment of clarity. It unfolded slowly, painfully, patiently. It began with simple things, like making his bed every morning just to prove to himself that he could take care of something, even if it was small. He went for walks with no music, no distractions, just the sound of his own breathing. He stopped giving automatic yes and started asking, "Do I really want this?" On Sundays, he created a ritual. He'd write one sentence in a notebook. What was the most honest choice I made this week? Sometimes the answer was none, but he kept writing anyway. No judgment, just practice. These small acts began to stitch him back together. Choosing to leave a conversation when he felt drained. Turning off his phone to read a book that made him feel alive. Eating alone at a restaurant without the need to perform confidence. Blocking out time on his calendar just to be with himself and treating that time as sacred. It wasn't selfish. It was self-respect. Eventually, he realized something that changed everything. Pleasing others had been easier than listening to himself. But the cost was unbearable. It cost him his life. These quiet habits, these daily choices became his way home. They weren't loud. They didn't impress anyone. But they were his. And that made them powerful.